There is a new superpower on the rise, and it's not China, it's not India. Rather, it's a country tucked away in the eastern part of Europe, Poland. The strange part is, up until the 1990s, Poland looked like this. Today, the Polish GDP per capita is expected to overtake the UK's by 2034. And it's not just that. In just 2 years, the Polish military is set to become one of the strongest in Europe. But how did it get here? Let's take a deeper look at Polish history to understand how it managed to overcome its past economic struggles to become one of the best performing economies in Europe. And finally, we'll be answering this one question: is Poland about to become the next global superpower? But first, we need to go all the way back to the start of World War II. Poland was the first country to be invaded by Nazi Germany, and by the end of the war, it was nearly unrecognizable. It had lost 20% of its population in the war and had been reduced to becoming one of the Soviet Union's satellite states. Poland found that its economy simply could not adjust to the rigid communist principles. In fact, even in 1989, 44 years after the war had ended, Poland had an annual GDP growth of just 0.2%. And at the same time, Poland suffered from massive hyperinflation, which sat at 244%. But the Polish people didn't just suffer from inflation. No, a lot of the time, even when they were ready to pay the insanely high prices, they would find that even most of the basic goods were in shortage. Added to this, even in 1989, Poland had hardly any exports in which it could rely on. In fact, its balance of trade for a long time was negative. This was especially troubling since other European states had already begun recovering from the effects of the war. And Poland was left behind. And it wasn't just Poland that was suffering. All the Eastern European countries that had been turned into Soviet Union satellite states were grappling with their communist economy. That was until 1989, when communism simply collapsed. The problem was that, unlike other Eastern European states, Poland's struggle with communism was much deeper. It was the only country that had not financed the majority of its debt and was also suffering from hyperinflation. The Soviet Union decided to withdraw from Poland. So in 1989, a new Polish Minister of Finance was appointed, Leszek Balcerowicz. This one man would set the stage for a new post-communist economy in Poland. But there was one small problem. By the time the Soviet Union left, Poland had become one of the poorest nations in all of Europe. So the government had to act fast. Poland was ready for a change. On the 1st of January of 1990, the Polish government revealed the biggest transformational plan the country has ever seen, the Balcerowicz Plan. The Balcerowicz Plan had ambitious goals to achieve. It had to bring macroeconomic stability to Poland to undo the damage it had suffered for the past 50 years. In particular, the plan focused on reducing the insane rate of inflation, decontrolling most processes, eliminating shortages, allowing for foreign trade, and making Polish currency convertible to other currencies. And though it was a tall order, most of the goals were actually achieved in a matter of a few months, in a process known as shock therapy. Other goals, such as the privatization of industries, took time. This is because the Polish government did not want to give away the major industries to a handful of businessmen and create an oligarchy, so it decided to have a more rigorous approach to the privatization of these industries. Poland knew that every step it took from that point forward would have permanent effects on the economy. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before, so Poland focused on the most pressing issues first. In 1991, when Poland was in the throes of its post-communism recession, its average income dropped to a third of the average real income in Germany. In fact, for a long time, Poles earned even less than the people of Gabon, Ukraine, or Suriname. It also wanted to have a more skilled labor force, so it began to introduce reforms in its education sector. Another big problem with the Polish economy was the labor wages. The wages had, for a long time, been kept artificially high and completely disproportionate to labor productivity. So the government decided to freeze wages. This, it hoped, would also bring down the prices of products. By 1992, the Polish economy had partially transitioned into a modern capitalist economy, and the country had begun crawling out of its recession. Of course, it wasn't easy. Poland had to face the challenge of adapting to the rapidly changing global economic landscape. During the 1990s, the main challenge that the country faced was to conform to capitalistic economic models of the global world. Though it did switch to capitalism quickly, as we mentioned earlier, it took its time with privatization. The 2000s decade provided another challenge: globalization. Poland wanted to become a part of the European integration, so it began adopting Western practices and institutions and distanced itself from its communist past. By 1997, Poland became part of the OECD. In 2004, Poland then joined the EU, its single market, and allowed a free movement of goods and services. During that time, the EU provided aid to the Eastern European states to help them strengthen their economy. And this was also done to bring down the wealth disparity between the rich and the poor states in the EU. Poland wisely used this money on infrastructure, roads, and education. This was monumental as it allowed its businesses to boom faster due to faster transportation and greater access to markets. As it joined the EU, other European countries began flocking over to Poland to set up their firms and businesses due to the low cost of Polish labor. And while all that happened, the Polish economy continued to grow. But even as Poland began opening itself up to the global world, it realized that it didn't really need foreign demand to bolster its economy. In fact, Polsk's domestic demand for its own goods and services was high enough to keep businesses going. This was a particularly huge strength for Poland, as it would later insulate the country from global economic changes, including some tough recessions. And ever since the Balcerowicz Plan, Poland's economy has been on an upward growth. This is pretty impressive since some of its European counterparts can't really say the same. The Polish banking system has been, for the most part, risk-adverse and therefore a stable investment option for many foreign investors. And since Poland has been so determined to integrate itself into the global economy, it began working to present itself as an attractive option to foreign investors. The Polish government is bent on providing the best possible resources and incentives for business and entrepreneurship. The economic reforms in 1990, in a way, paved the way for Poland's golden age, which lasted almost 30 years. Its GDP per capita had increased by a staggering 150%. In 1990, the figure was at $10,000. In 2018, it reached $28,000. This is greater than any other country in Europe. But let's take a deeper look at it. In that same period, the GDP per capita of the Czech Republic grew only by 75%. The Hungarian GDP per capita grew by barely half. Overall, the average GDP per capita of the Eurozone increased by just a little less than 40%. And keep in mind, Poland only joined the EU in 2004 and had to overcome its old communist rule. In just 14 years, its average income level was around 66% higher than that of the Eurozone. While Poland had spent much of its time in the last 2 decades playing catch-up to the other European powers, it may be true that it's at the finish line. So Poland might just be the best performing economy in Europe right now. For example, in 2020, many nations underwent an economic recession, but while the average OECD GDP contraction was estimated to be around 5.5%, Poland's GDP had only contracted by 3.5%. This is impressive, especially if you compare it to the UK, which suffered almost 10% GDP contraction. This is largely because, unlike other nations that rely a great deal on foreign trade, Poland's domestic market is so strong that it can withstand any change in foreign demand. After all, up until the 1990s, as we've seen earlier in this video, Poland didn't really have many foreign exports going on. In 2019, the IMF reported that Poland had an impressive GDP growth of 9%. This continued for the years 2021 and 2022, where Polish GDP growth reached 5.1 and 4.6% respectively. Poland's exports had steadily increased since the 1990s, and by the end of 2022 amounted to 237.5 billion euros. Poland today has managed to increase its export by 25 times, and at the same time, Poland's unemployment ratio has been lower than the EU's average for over a decade. But it's not just the economy that Poland has been working on. Recently, it announced its plans to increase its military strength. Following the 2022 invasion of Russia into Ukraine, Poland felt the need to have a stronger defense. According to one report, Warsaw had bought 1,000 tanks and 600 artillery pieces, which would bring its total firearm strength to a figure higher than that of the UK, Germany, and Italy combined. It also decided to double the size of its military, and today it has reached 300,000. In addition to this, Poland has spent billions of dollars on firearms, artillery, aircraft, armor, and drones. The heavy metal purchases made by Poland arrived in the form of 33 M1 Abrams and a $4.9 billion purchase of 250 T-72 tanks that are around the same in numbers of the ones in the Russian army. With all of its military acquisitions, there is a high chance that Poland may emerge as the biggest land superpower in Europe. A large catalyst in its military expansion was the Russian invasion. However, it's a possibility that Poland may have been preparing for ambitious military transformation for a long time. If Poland's economy continues to grow at this rate, the country will be able to triple its economy by 2050. In fact, Poland is projected to overtake the UK in terms of wealth by 2030. Its forefront role in the Russian-Ukraine conflict has been pivotal in turning a once-forgotten underdog economy into an influential regional force. Keeping these developments in mind, let's see where Poland might end up in the future. Currently, it is building its hard power to match that of Russia, and it is likely that in the near future, Poland may be dominating the global world stage, or at least Europe, through both its soft and hard power. But keep in mind, there are certain weaknesses in the Polish economy, namely its aging population, its migrant crisis, and high inflation. If Poland manages to address them effectively, it will make even greater leaps in economic success. It appears so far that Poland had focused on establishing its presence on a more regional scale rather than a global one. As such, for it to gain the status of a superpower and rival the global influence in countries such as the USA, China, or even India, it might need just a little more time than any of us think. But one thing's for sure, Poland is certainly moving on the right track to become one.